Welcome to Warrior Woodshop. My name is Jason Rodaway. I've been an industrial arts instructor now for about 20 years. In this video, we're going to build a beginner level tool tote. The goal of this video is for my students to get familiar with some basic power tool usage, such as cross-cutting saws, drilling, and routering. We'll also focus a little bit on their measuring and layout techniques. Before we actually begin the project, I want to quote a very inspirational woodworker from the television show New Yankee Workshop, Norm Abrams. Be sure to read, understand, and follow all the safety rules that come with your power tools. Knowing how to use these power tools properly will greatly reduce the risk of personal injury. And remember this, there's no more important safety rule than to wear these, your safety glasses. Now let's get started. For this project, you're going to need 16 inches of dowel rod, 3/4 in diameter, 32 inches of 1x4, and 32 inches of 1x8. Those are rough lengths. The first inclination is to grab your tape measure and start marking out according to the plan. One of the things we need to make sure of it is that the end of our boards are actually square. This can be done very simply by going over the cross-cutting saw, cutting off about 1/8 or 1/4 inch at the end of the board with the saw set at 90 degrees. In our class, we refer to that as squaring out the end of the board. It's also a good idea to mark that in so when you get back to the workbench, you know which one to hook the tape measure on. Now that we're back from the cross-cutting saw and we've got our squared up ends, we need to mark out 14.5 inches twice from on the 1x4s and 14.5 inches on the 1x8 for the floor. The other part will be for the ends. You want to use some sort of square. Make sure your lines are all the way across. And now we're going to head back to the cross-cutting saw. On this project, it's pretty important that the floor and the two sides be exactly the same length. Even if you can be careful with measuring, there's sometimes a margin of error that it's just difficult to overcome. And what we're going to do is line the saw up with our mark, take a scrap board. Sometimes this works better if you have a partner, but if you don't, you can still do it by yourself. And clamp a scrap block against the vents, creating a stop. Now when I cut the floor and the two sides, we're pretty much guaranteed that they're all three the same length. Voila, right on the money. We're back from the cross-cutting saw. You should end up with 3 identical in length pieces, 1 wide, 2 narrow. The leftover 17 or so inches are going to be used for the 2 ends. The 2 narrow pieces become your sidewalls, and the wide piece becomes your floor. Now you can see the importance of having them identical in length and why we use the stop block. So next, we want to start doing our layout on the bottom for where our screw locations are going to go. Now that we've marked out how far in the screws go from the ends of the board, we need to mark how far in they go from the side. And a good tool for that is the combination square. 1/2 and 3/4 is 3/8. So what I'm going to do is set this to 3/8, run this along my edge. Every place I put a mark, put a little crosshair. And that will show me where to use the drill. Now that we got our screws laid out on the bottom piece, this should be the underside that we're working from. We're going to get a drill and a couple of clamps. Clamp our material so we're not drilling into the workbench. And since these screws are going to be covered, we're not really worried about too much chip out. In a 1/8 drill bit, pre-drill the hole. I'm going to switch drill bits to what's called a countersink. We don't want the screw head sticking out. The whole point is to get it to where the heads can sink just below the surface or equal to it. Let's set that off to the side. Now let's focus on our ends. The ends are 8 inches tall. We left this together for a reason, because we got to do some drilling on one end, and it doesn't allow any room for us to clamp. So by having the pieces still connected at this point, we can clamp one side, do our drill work on the other, flip it around and drill the other side. So what we're going to do first, I've already squared up the ends. I'm going to measure down 8 inches from both sides. Square. Square those across. Now this is the top of each piece, and that'll come into play later. Each end needs to be the top. Top, 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 top. We want the handle to be 3/4 of an inch from the top and in the center. One way to check for center is to measure both directions. You should have equal measurements. One thing I like to do is go ahead and lay out where the pieces are going to be. So this is the bottom. I'm going to take a scrap and trace that across. Put a big X in the middle so I know that's the scrap. What I'm basically doing is giving myself a visual reference of where all the pieces are going to go. This will avoid, or hopefully avoid, drilling in the accidental holes. You want to measure up 1 3/4 inches and 3.5 from each bottom. So from this line, I want to measure up 1 3/4 inches and 3.5, which means the screw going into this board here will be 3/4 from each end. I could do that on the other side, or use my combination square and scribe the lines across. Reset this back to the 3/8 and make my crosshairs. These holes we're going to drill on the drill press, because we're actually going to do a technique called a counter bore, where we actually can hide the head of the screw. All right, here we are at the drill press, and we are going to set up the drill to drill about 1/4 of an inch or no more than halfway through. And instead of trying to quick grip on both sides and reclamp there and reclamp here, we're going to set up a fence system. With the fence system, you don't have to reclamp every time. I got that in position. Now I'm going to back it up just a little bit and position it to where it goes about the depth of the Forstner bit. Unlock the depth stop. Now that we've got our counterboard screw holes drilled, we've switched over to a 3/4 inch bit, which matches our handle diameter. Get everything lined up. If you have a partner, this goes a little bit easier. This time, since we're drawing all the way through, we've got the auxiliary table. The depth has already been preset, so it doesn't drill in through that. Double check, everything looks good. It may look like, hey, we're ready to put this thing together. We got a couple more steps. To complete a counterboard hole, we need to drill a pilot hole. The larger hole we just drilled was just to put a cover or a plug in on top of the screw. So I'm going to clamp it to my workbench. The Forstner bit left a dimple or a center point That's what I'm using as a guide for the pilot bit, the small 1/8 inch. That completes all the holes we need to drill. We're over here at the miter saw to cut our angles. If you've already cut your pieces into two, this setup is not going to work. It's going to be too small to safely operate, so you're going to have to use the bandsaw. And if you're not comfortable with this setup, you can still use the bandsaw. Just by using the miter saw, that gives a little more accuracy, because we're going to utilize a similar stop block system. Just it'll take a little bit different setup. So what we're going to do is go ahead and make the first cut. Definitely wait for it to stop, because this little triangle in here could be a major kickback player. Throw another strap in. I'm going to lock the saw down to set up my stop block. Take a piece of plywood and clamp it to the table. Now I can unlock the saw, rotate it around. Now we have consistent angles on both ends. We're almost ready to cut them apart. Don't get quite in a hurry yet. It'll look really good and actually be easier on the hands if you don't have this sharp corner. So a round over or a chamfered edge would be really nice on the outside of the ends. We're also going to chamfer both sides of the rails just to give it a little softer edge, kind of a design element too. But on the end pieces, because the piece has to connect, we don't want to chamfer or router over the inside. And this has to be done before you assemble it for a couple of reasons. One, it's going to be too hard to handle on either a handheld router or router table. Two, you might contact the screws with the router bit, and that would not be a good combination for either. So we're going to put it with the screw counterbore holes down, and we're going to router all the sides. We want to do the same thing to the rail pieces. Now we're ready to cut it apart. Now that we've got our two pieces, we can get off all the pencil marks. Just take a piece of sandpaper, wrap it around a little scrap of wood. Make sure you sand it with the grain. Sand as much as you can now. It is much more difficult to get into all the corners and all the pencil marks off once you put it together. Don't forget to, it's called soften your corners. Just give everything a once over, even the edges. Now that we've got everything sanded, we're actually ready to put this thing together. Make sure you got your screws, your glue, you're going to want a couple of clamps, all of your pieces, and either a drill or an impact. Before I actually put the glue on, I'm going to do what's called a dry fit. Basically, that's putting it together without glue. Check to make sure this fits. That's a nice snug fit. Sometimes I've found you need to sand the dowel rods a little bit. All right. From a dry fit perspective, this is looking pretty good. Once we apply glue, we've got a 5-minute window before it starts to gum over and it's not effective. So I'm going to take advantage of the table clamps or the vices. Kind of give everything a practice run through. That looks good. So now I can apply my glue. You want just enough glue that you know it's there, but it's not going to make a big mess. Got my drill ready to go. Got my screws ready to go. Now that I got that in place, use my quick grips. And yeah, I might be covering the 2 outside screws right now, but I'm just going to get the middle one in place first. If you are painting the project, you can just spread the glue. If you are staining the project, you want to take a wet rag, because stain will not soak through the glue. Second side seems to be a little tricky sometimes, but one little trick I've learned is use quick grips as board stands. So if you don't have access to a table vise, you can use the quick grip as a board stand. The miracles of photography. Right? Awesome. All right. Whoop, I got glue on the inside. I need my rag again. A good rule of thumb on the rag is you want it damp, where your hand feels wet, but it's not dripping. You don't want to incorporate water in your project. Everything looks good there. We are ready to add the ends. All right, this all looks good. Now it's time to add the ends. We'll go ahead and add one end. We're gonna those pre-drilled holes are preventing everything from splitting. So you might have saved yourself 5 minutes by not doing it then, but you're gonna cause a lot more problems. Remember all the layout work that we did. The screw's not poking out the side or splitting the edge. All that pays off in the end. Makes you look like a champ. Check for any wet glue. Flip it over. Depending on the fit of your handle, there's a drop of glue. Oh my gosh, I'm getting glue on my fingers. But that's where a rag comes into play. If you do use your finger, make sure you clean it off, because again, you don't want it all over the place. You could glue both ends of the handle in, but my theory is if one end's glued, it's not coming out. And there we are. Check for wet glue. Now that we got it all assembled, let's do some final sanding. Make sure there's no pencil marks, any rough edges, and all the corners. Make sure you sand with the grain on your final pass. This should actually be pretty easy because you've done most of the sanding before you actually put it together. It's just a little final touch-up. Watch for these corners right here. That's where you want to make sure you give a little bit of personal touch to it. All we have left to do now is cover up our counterbore screws. Now we need to figure out a way to cover up these screw heads, but we want that to look good. So, in this case, depending on what you've chosen, we've got some pre-purchased wooden buttons. Another option is to use a plug cutter and use some scrap wood and make your own. But whether you make your own plugs or whether you're using buttons, the procedure is the same to install them. You put a little drop of wood or drop of glue in each one of the holes. Doesn't take much. You set it in there. You go rubber mallet. Start trying to hold on to an M&M. Once you're done, you need a rag to clean up. Flip it over and do it to the other side. There you've got it. After you've covered up all your holes, done some final sanding, throw some personality into it. Do a little paint, a little stain, maybe a combination of them both. And you've got yourself a little tool tote used for whatever you want. Okay. Please take into mind, for those of you that are not my students in class, happen to be watching this on YouTube, this was designed for my students. I'm actually kind of encouraged to see what variations you may come up with. Feel free to post pictures of your projects or replies. Again, thanks for watching.